Less than a decade after Aurangzeb's death in 1707 in the Deccan, he campaigned there for like 3 decades to try and finish off the Marathas. He couldn't. 12 years after his death, the Marathas were here at the gates of Delhi. And the Marathas are an incredibly resilient force.
I think in Indian history, there is no other example that I can think of where the ruler willingly hands over power to his prime ministers. He doesn't try to interfere and he gives them free run. And the Peshwas, they are a real heroic story.
If you go to Noida and go to the golf course, you'll find a huge memorial erected there which says very explicitly that the Battle of Patparganj was fought between the British and the Maratha forces. So Delhi was captured by the English from the Marathas.
Any Game of Thrones fans here? Anyone seen Game of Thrones? You remember the red wedding sequence from the Game of Thrones? One of the crucial chapters in Game of Thrones is the red wedding sequence, where there's a assassination of one of the key characters there. It's called the Robb Stark and his merry men, and they're all murdered there. That's a very key turning point in Game of Thrones series. And similarly in Maratha history, which is real, which actually happened not so long ago, 250 years back, the assassination of Narayan Rao Peshwa is a key turning point in that.
Anandibai साहेबांना सुमर सिंगाच्या हातामध्ये कसला तरी हुकमाचा कागद दिलाय आणि म्हणाला तुकडे तुकडे झालं पाहिजे काय बी करून
काय झालं काय गडबड आहे
काय नाही गार्दी वाड्यात शिरले आहे त्यांच्या गर्दीत लागला असेल कोणाला तरी
गार्दी नारळाला मारताय
काय आपल्या सुटपाची अंमलबजावणी करता असते
त्याला मारायचा हुकूम दिला नाही
मी दिला आहे तसा हुकूम तू होय तुमच्यासाठी तुम्हाला राज्यात धनी काढण्यासाठी मी दिला आहे तो हुकूम नाही गार्दी आता ऐकणार नाही
नाही मी मोड देणार नाही त्याला आपल्या श्रीमंतांनी थोडा सरकार खबर राहू तुला
आता याला वाचत असेल तर मला मारा माझ्यावर तलवार चालवा एकदा हुकूम दिला आता माघार घेता अचानक राज्य जाईल सगळ्यांची डोकी मारली जातील माझा ऐका टाका तलवार.
You just saw the presentation from Uday Kulkarni, and I'm going to talk to him, and of course deeply honored to be here in such august company, Dr. Meenakshi Jain, Swapan Dasgupta, to talk about this very interesting chapter of the Maratha Empire. Oh, the books are here. Fine, wait, we'll just unveil the books and then we'll continue our conversation. Udayji, tell us about this character Raghoba. I mean, what a fascinating character, what a tragic character, what a brave general, what a interesting personality, and he gets caught into this vortex, and this assassination of Narayan Rao Peshwa is something that completely turns the trajectory of the Maratha Empire.
Raghoba is one of the most fascinating characters in the second half of the 18th century, because what he did had an impact and it had an impact on history that followed. Born son of the great Bajirao Peshwa, his father died when he was about less than 5 years of age, and practically his elder brother, who was the next Peshwa, Nana Sahib Peshwa, who was the Peshwa from 1740 to 1761, who was almost 13 years older than him, he was a natural guardian. And you find that the first few expeditions which Raghoba went were all in the north. He was the man who captured Ahmedabad for the Marathas in 1753. 1753 to 55, he carried out huge expeditions in the north along with the Holkars and the Scindias. He went to Kumail, fought with the Jats. He came to Delhi. He deposed the emperor in 1754. And that entire campaign went on, ended with the capture of the fort of Gwalior for the first time by the Marathas in 1755. So during this time, his brother, who was the Peshwa, afforded him a certain amount of liberty. I mean, he could go on campaigns, spend some money. He may not bring back sufficient amount of money back with him, but being a younger brother, he was kind of looked after. His acts of commission, omission were kind of overlooked. And then he went for what actually he is known for, and that was when Ahmad Shah Abdali's invasions of India started in 1747, 48, 52. 57 was the most brutal one of them, of the lot, when he not only sacked Delhi, but he also carried out a massacre at Mathura and Vrindavan. And after he went back, the Marathas came back. They took back Delhi from Najib Khan, who was from Najibabad. And then they entered the Punjab for the first time. And they chased out Abdali's son and general from Lahore. And they took Lahore in 1758. And they sent out parties which captured Multan, which captured Attock on the other side of the river Indus. And they went all the way to Peshawar, which was captured by the Marathas in that very year. And in September 1758, Raghoba was at its peak because he was actually rose water was sprinkled on him in the Shalimar Gardens of Lahore. So that was probably his peak of his career.
So that's where you get the phrase, and it's there in Marathi as well, the Attak to Katak, the Maratha Empire that spanned from Attak to Katak. But for the benefit of our audience, Udayji, tell us about this very fascinating institution of the Peshwa. It's something that's existed without possibly any precedent in modern history, and in recent history. And if I could use this analogy, it's like Chhatrapati Shivaji and his son Sambhaji. We've all seen him in Chhawa, the movie that was made recently. It's still doing extremely well. You had the founders of the kingdom who then, one of the founders decides to hand it over to a CEO kind of institution. And that's, so tell us this.
Actually, Peshwa comes from a Persian word, like Pesh, when you say, the foremost. So he was the prime minister of the Maratha rule. I mean, even during Chhatrapati Shivaji's time, he had 8 ministers, of which the senior most was the Peshwa. The first Peshwa was one Shamraj, then there was one Moropant Peshwa, who was there throughout Shivaji's career. He went on expeditions and so on. And then his sons became Peshwas in Kolhapur as well as Satara, when the two parts of the Maratha kingdom were formed in 1707. In 1713, what is conventionally called the Peshwai, when Chhatrapati Shahu was Chhatrapati Sambhaji's son, was imprisoned by Aurangzeb for 18 long years and released after his death by his son. When he came back and founded a kingdom at Satara, he appointed Balaji Vishwanath as the Peshwa in 1713. And what is conventionally called the Peshwa actually begins with the appointment of Balaji Vishwanath in 1713. Now, Balaji Vishwanath laid the foundations of the consolidated Shahu's rule. Now, these are all names which are coming rapidly at you, and no time to kind of take one name in before the next one is shot at you. But Shahu ruled for about 40 years, from 1740 to 1714. He was titular Chhatrapati, the king. But after 18 long years in the Mughal prison, from the age of 7 onwards, he was not accustomed to to lead armies into war and those. But he was a very good king in his own right, and he chose good instruments for whatever work had to be done in his empire. So it was Balaji Vishwanath who first came to Delhi in 1719, leading a Maratha army, changed emperors for the first time, just 12 years after the death of Aurangzeb. So that is when the Marathas reached Delhi in 1719, and his son Bajirao actually took the empire from the Jamuna to the Tungabhadra. That is where the expanse of the empire began. Really.
So the events in your book are roughly, if you look at the movie Chhawa, because that's caught popular imagination now. Give us an idea of how many years after the death of Sambhaji is this book set?
Chhatrapati Sambhaji was killed in 1689. And this book deals with a period from 1772 to 1775. So we have about 80, 89 years, 85 years gap between where this book, because this is the 8th book of the 18th century that I'm writing. Earlier books have described the period before that. Now, if you want an international equivalent of what the Peshwa means, it's the prime minister. But it's something like the shogun in Japan. Something similar to the shogun.
So if you've seen the OTT series Shogun, you'll get a good reference of what the Peshwa actually means. And in fact, I'm going to ask you later on why your 8 books have not already been made into an OTT series. But before that, Swapan, the Maharashtrian Brahmins, what a fascinating example of Brahmins who are meant to be scholars and administrators suddenly becoming generals, fighting the Afghans. You know, there's 20 or 30 Maharashtrian Brahmins, this very interesting community of Maharashtrian Brahmins who turn into warriors, generals, administrators. Is there any precedent to this in Indian history of a community that's primarily of priests and scholars and administrators becoming warriors?
Well, before I answer that question, let me just take off from 2 things you observed. First is you said Maratha history is not taught in schools. Second, you tried to relate everything with various films, none of which I've seen. Now, the whole issue of that Maratha history at one time was probably the most explored subject in Indian history. From about the 1950s to the 1970s, no history in modern Indian history was complete without a thorough dissection of the Peshwas, of Shivaji, right up to Panipat, 1761. What happened? Why did Maratha history become out of fashion? This is strange because this is one aspect where the records are probably the most exhaustive. When the Brits conquered Pune, took over Pune after 1818, they found the entire set of archives, which is called the Peshwai Daftar, intact. So no other place in no other sort of part of Indian history is so beautifully documented as Maratha. Now, 2 things happened. One, Maratha history became equated with reactionary trends. What exactly you were talking about? They got identified with only something to do with the Brahmins. Number 1. Number 2, the study of history itself became such that the language of these records, which was Marathi in a particular script, Morvi script, wasn't known by very many people. It's not that old. I mean, those who study German history will recognize that there is a Germanic sort of script and things which is there till about the 1930s. After that, something more modern comes in. But it's part of this. But here, the study of history through archival research became unpopular. I'm just giving this as a background. It is fascinating because it is often said that the British took over India after Plassey. I would contest that. I think why this book is very significant is that in that brief period between 1761, which is the Third Battle of Panipat, and 1818, with the Treaty of Bassein, where the entire Peshwaship and the Marathas became just a sort of one of those dependent states, the Confederacy. Between that thing, the decline is actually most vividly. So Raghoba's life, while it also marks the peak of the takeover of Attock, also Raghoba's actions signals the decay and decline and everything decrepit which started happening in the Maratha thing. So that's why this is very fascinating, this book. And it's not merely Raghoba who's fascinating, the number of characters there. Anandibai, There's a gentleman called Rama Shastri,
Yeah.
a chief justice. Each of them and the parampara which surrounds them, all of this is so vividly documented. You see, Uday, why is Uday Kulkarni great, to my mind? Now, let me just tell you. There are a lot of people who write Indian history without knowing, without actually consulting the primary sources. Now, there is a space for that. I'm saying there's a space for narrative history which can just tell a story. And a lot of people have done that very well. But primary research without knowing the documents cannot be done. And he is one of the last, alas, one of the last, who is actually consulting all those documents which are there. And he's only touched a little bit of it. There's so much more which can be done.
There's so much more indeed, Swapanda. I mean, it's fascinating for you to say that. And the fact is that, this book is, as Udayji mentioned, it's his 8th book. So if you want to actually understand the history of the 18th century, as Swapanda said, you have to read all 8 books. This is just one chapter. There are other fascinating books like the Maratha Century that's been written on this, and Solstice at Panipat. We want to know exactly what went wrong in Panipat. That's the book for you. But Meenakshi Jain, I have to ask you this about the sad story of Raghoba, and as Swapanda mentioned, that it's at one instance, it's the height of the Maratha Empire, and the other, it's also its decline. This one question that a lot of people have asked, and I'm sure many of you in the audience would also have that same question as well, that less than a decade after Aurangzeb's death in 1707 in the Deccan, he campaigned there for like 3 decades to try and finish off the Marathas. He couldn't. 12 years after his death, the Marathas were here at the gates of Delhi. And the Marathas are an incredibly resilient force. They are unlike anything that the Mughals have ever encountered. And that tells you why Aurangzeb was there for 3 decades in the Deccan trying to finish them off. And of course he didn't. And they were back here and they kept coming back. After every successive defeat, they keep rebounding. Why did the Marathas never really sit on the throne of Delhi?
I just want to say one or two things. I think in Indian history, there is no other example that I can think of where the ruler willingly hands over power to his prime ministers. He doesn't try to interfere and he gives them free run. And the Peshwas, they are a real heroic story, which you read Uday Kulkarni's books, then you will know about it. But what I found very, very puzzling in this book that I read is that, at the time when the Peshwa is killed, around the same time, politics in the Mughal court lead to the assassination of one emperor after the other. And there's so much intrigue. So a parallel scenario that we are seeing in the Peshwa's court and the Mughal court, the Peshwas overcome that and become a dominant power again. But the Mughals don't recover their lost stature. So how do you account for that is my question to you.
And you can also answer my question.
So basically, it's every empire has a shelf life, as I keep saying. And when the Mughals were in decline, they came into decline because of Chhatrapati Shivaji's efforts to kind of put them out of business, because of their atrocities, because of their fanaticism. And these are the reasons why there were so many uprisings against them. And of course, it was Chhatrapati Shivaji's bid which actually pushed them back. And Aurangzeb, for the last 25 years of his life, spent away from his capital, Delhi and Agra. He spent 25 years in the Deccan and finally was buried there in 1707. So this was a momentum which carried them across the Narmada. And in the 18th century, they really came into their own. And in 1719, they came to Delhi. 1737, Bajirao, Talkatora, he camped there. He attacked Delhi. In 1750s, again, they came here. The Emperor Ahmad Shah was deposed. 1748, Nana Sahib was called by Muhammad Shah to face the invasion of Nana Sahib. So from being enemies, you find that the Mughals became a protected regime of the Marathas. And actually, to continue calling the Mughal as a king, as an emperor, beyond 1719 because they were all being controlled by their wazirs. And their, like Shah Alam, there's a famous quote that his rule extends from Delhi to Palam. So that's what and later on it even was restricted to the Red Fort. So to really equate the two at that time was difficult. At the same time, Narayan Rao Peshwas was the only political assassination that occurred in 175 years of Maratha rule. There was never an assassination of that kind. While in the Mughals, it happened with every succession. So there's a difference, a qualitative difference, I would say, between the two regimes and the manner in which they approached gain for political power, the way they followed the conventional rules. You find it after this death, the Chhatrapati at that time in Satara was Ram Raja, and he writes a letter that this is unacceptable. And it is unacceptable because what Raghoba has done is not dharma. It is adharma, and therefore he must be punished for whatever act he has done. So that was the concept which remained in the Marathas for a very long time.
You know, one more thing, when I was reading your book, you talked about the importance of the Gardis. Gardis. Now, the thing is that these were mercenary people. They were there in every army. So, what is this pretext that they gave that they were not paid for so many months? I mean, that doesn't seem to be a very plausible explanation for them murdering the Peshwa. Because every regional power had these mercenaries in their troops and they were in arrears everywhere.
Actually, the plot against the Peshwa is a very layered plot. Starting from with one incident, other people joining it, and a third party being engaged later on, and finally the executioners of this plan were the people who had the military power to do it, which were the Gardis. And the Gardis were basically not mercenaries, because at that time the Maratha Empire had grown so large that it was impossible for only people from Maharashtra to govern such a large area. So it was the biggest employment market in India at that time, which was later on taken over by the English. And that's why you find people flocking to the English standard after in the 19th century for employment. So this was the biggest. They had captured the South Asian military employment market at that time. And after you finish your agricultural season, you go and join the Marathas. So we had Telangis in the army, we had Purbaiyas in the Maratha army, we had Gardis, and Gardis did not particularly belong to a community or a caste. Like the three people who are convicted of murdering Narayan Rao, you find two of them are from the north, one is a Muslim, and usually Marathi people would not join the Gardis. They were more interested in the cavalry or the infantry. The Gardis were trained in the fashion of the French artillery guru. Their guru was Bussy, who was once upon a time linked with the Nizam and who actually sustained the Nizam for a pretty long time. So, and when the Marathas realized that they had to have an artillery arm, though they had their own efforts, they finally got this man on employment. And Ibrahim Khan Gardi in the Battle of Panipat actually gave up his life for the cause. He did not defect to Abdali even when feelers were sent out to him that defect and come on to our side. So they were true to their profession. Now this thing about agitating for salary was an excuse to gather in the Shaniwar Wada in the palace of the Peshwa and try to push your way through that. We have come here for our salary and so on. The intention was very clear when they entered the palace that they had to assassinate the Peshwa, because the plot had been in the making for about 6 months before that. And on the very day of the assassination, the news had reached that there's something afoot. So, but the military chief, the commander of the Peshwa's forces said, I will attend to it in the afternoon. These people came to know the plot has leaked out and they decided to act preemptively. And therefore they struck before that commander could really do something.
It was a bit like the Wagner coup that we saw recently against President Putin. You know, the Gardis coming there. Of course, Wagner never got that far. But, Udayji, this question that always, bothers a lot of us is that why did the Marathas never really sit on the throne of Delhi? If the Mughal emperor was their puppet, why did they not just do the right thing and depose him and capture power and rule themselves, the biggest empire in the world at that time?
This is a question I'm asked every time. And I'll just say this, that the Maratha Balasthan or the Shakti Sthan which they had was in the south. It was not in Delhi. And it was not necessary for them to consider Delhi as their capital. You find that the English ruled from Calcutta until 1911. And the English also did not depose the Mughal emperor till 1857. They allowed him to reign into inverted commas while they ruled. So Marathas found this model much easier. They have a pliable, weak puppet emperor here, a phantom, a cipher, if you want, and make him follow the dictates. I mean, the wazir was appointed by the Marathas. So they had to tell the wazir, get this thing done, it was done. Of course, there were periods in between when they, like after the Battle of Panipat, when they lost power for a few years, and within 10 years, they were back in power in Delhi. So, and till 1803, I mean, if you go to Noida and go to the golf course, you'll find a huge memorial erected there, which says very explicitly that the Battle of Patparganj was fought between the British and the Maratha forces. So, Delhi was captured by the English from the Marathas, under Scindias actually. So, the whole pattern, and Chhatrapati Shahu in the 1730s, when Nadir Shah came to Delhi, there's a letter written that the Chhatrapati does not desire to come and rule in Delhi. Now, if the king doesn't want to come to Delhi, it is not possible for his prime minister to come and declare Delhi as his capital. And in Delhi, they didn't have the Balasthan, the Shakti Sthan was not here.
Right. It was not their center of gravity. And but interesting thing, and a lot of people are still under the impression, as we were speaking, about the fact that how power in India went from the Mughals to the British, and they forget this almost a century of Maratha rule. And in fact, I've heard a very big Maharashtrian politician in one of our events that we'd organized. He said, "Pehle Mughal the, uske baad Angrez aaye." And so I was like, my God, he just skipped 100 years of Maratha rule right there. So, Swapan, this thing of why is Maratha history forgotten? Why are they the forgotten warriors? This very amazing institution of the Peshwai that ruled for almost a century, this hereditary prime ministership that controlled Attak to Katak at one point. Why is this not given the kind of importance? Like you mentioned, 50s to 70s it was studied, but after that, what happened?
No, I don't think we can have any definitive answer to that, but I think there are certain issues which are there. When Shivaji, Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj, crowned himself king, he was not crowned the king of the Deccan. He was crowned the king of the Hindus.
Hindu.
Yeah, Hindu Swaraj, and then there was the entire notion of Hindu Padshai, which the Peshwas took as their defining sort of mantra. But over the years, when the sort of notion of Chaut and Sardeshmukhi took over, the Maratha armies, the Maratha entire, the defining logic of the Maratha army became one of extraction. Which is why the notion of, say, how the Marathas are viewed in Bengal, for instance, is not very charitable. And it's precisely to do with that. And the British took advantage of that to a very large extent. Here we have this bizarre example of Raghoba actually facilitating as much as possible the advent of the British. So, why that 100 years is kept in silence, I cannot answer definitively. But I think it's a very mixed thing. You have the Marathas being viewed at one level as a bunch of mercenaries, and at the same time, towards the beginning of the 20th century, the Marathas all over India are heralded as the model empire. Even in Bengal, which is where the Burgis are looked upon as, the bandits, you have a whole load of people who were named Shivaji at that time. And Tagore's poems also talk about the valor of the Marathas. So this contradiction was there. But it doesn't answer your question, because I don't think there is any definite answer to that.
But I have a question to ask you, that even if we agree that there was this image that the Marathas had of exploiting, but the successor Maratha kingdoms that came up in Nagpur, Gaikwad's host,
The Confederacy.
they didn't have that image. Like Ahilyabai Holkar, the Baroda house, they were regarded as patrons of learning and revival of Hindu civilization. They were great temple builders. They patronized education. So, how do you reconcile these two aspects of that same community?
Actually, it's very difficult because they're defining an elephant, I would say. And as for the Marathas are concerned, there's a clear divide between the period of Chhatrapati Shivaji and the later period. And the initial constitution of the Maratha state was a centralized constitution with the king supreme and the salary of all the other employees and the army paid directly from a central treasury. This system was disrupted in the 25-year-long war with Aurangzeb. And the Mughals, when they started giving watans and jagirs to different people in the Deccan, the Chhatrapati, who was actually in a siege way down in Tamil Nadu, in the fort of Jinji, had to give reciprocal grants to his people. There's a very famous letter written by Chhatrapati Rajaram in the 1690s, where he said, I have kept 6 lakh hones reserved. The first one is when you capture Daulatabad. The second one is when you capture Raigad. And the third 2 lakh hone have been kept aside when you capture Delhi. So the aim of capturing Delhi was there from the 1690s onwards. Though he was sitting in a fort in the deep south, surrounded by Mughal forces for 8 long years. So you find that the system which was laid down by Chhatrapati Shivaji went through a transformation in the sense that when Chhatrapati Shahu became the king, he had, like Surendranath Sen in this military system of the Marathas, brings it out very well, that while Shivaji was the king, later on, when during Chhatrapati Shahu's time, he had to depend on the component parts, the Peshwa and the other chiefs, to govern their respective territories and return the revenue to the central treasury. So, in fact, Surendranath Sen goes so far as to say that the king at that stage was actually drawing a pension by delegating these parts to others. While this helped in the rapid expansion of the empire, in the later days, what the English did, today you hear these terms, the Maharaja Gaikwad, the Maharaja Sindhya. Now, when did they become Maharajas? It was only in the British time. And when you tell somebody that we will make you an independent Maharaja, you are pandering to a divisive kind of a force which exists within the empire. You are breaking up that and telling people, okay, you're a different entity. You don't belong to the center. So they all became Maharajas and today are called as such. But they were never known as Maharajas as such as long as, at least till this book, 1775. So there were multiple factors at play at that time which kind of changed. I mean, in the last 75 years, you see how India has changed. In the 175 years of Maratha rule, it is no surprise that you went through several changes, especially when they were not as autocratic as the 4 Mughal emperors. That if you don't agree with me, it's off with your head. That never happened. You never had pyramids of cut heads at the end of every battle outside the tent of Maratha chiefs. So even the atrocities in Bengal, it was only the Nagpur Bhosles along with Mir Habib who came down there, and that too they came to Bengal because Ali Vardi Khan usurped the dynasty of Murshid Quli Khan and took over Bengal. That became that if you have come there and usurped them, then you have to, if you want to continue your rule, you better pay as a chowth. And 12 lakh rupees a year was the amount decided. And because Ali Vardi Khan refused to pay that amount, the battle went on for 10 years, 1741 to 1751. The Bargi raids have been immortalized because of the poetry and the Maharashtra Puran by Gangaram. But collateral damages occurred in every battle. And the policy of the Marathas was simply to have a scorched earth policy, burn the granaries so the army of Ali Vardi Khan does not get the grains required to feed their army. So this happened, but this is documented by a poet of that time, and that is why it has come down to us with these kind of, and that explains the kind of animosity. But it was not the Nanasaheb Peshwa went to Bengal, and he in fact opposed Raghuji Bhosle of Nagpur. They had a small fight there, and he pushed him out. But he did not commit any atrocity. So it is one branch of the family which went through Orissa into Bengal, which is considered to have done this. But nowhere else will you find any such references in the vast expanse. I'll just, we are running out of time. So I'll just end this by saying that the Marathas were the first indigenous empire after 4 centuries of Turco-Persian Afghan rule. And they were the last indigenous empire before we once again succumbed to a colonial power. Yeah, but they were only in a certain part of India. an India-wide empire, if you see, yes. So
Destruction of the sea.
yes, but that was beyond the Satluj or in Punjab. So if you look at all over the whole country as a whole, you find that this becomes the last indigenous part.
It's a tragedy of monumental proportions. The breakup of the Swarajya and the Samrajya, my mistake, and the creation of all these small little kingdoms, which is what this book actually tells you about. It's one of the most critical chapters in Maratha history. You just heard it from Uday Kulkarni, the fact that this assassination changed Indian history like very few other assassinations in the past. And of course, I'd like to thank Dr. Meenakshi Jain, Swapan Dasgupta, and of course, Uday Kulkarni for joining us this afternoon. A fascinating discussion on Maratha history, that very forgotten chapter of our Indian history. And if any of you want to read more about this, there are 7 other books written by Uday Kulkarni. You can get them on Amazon and you can